Sri Lankan Parliament has accepted the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Rajapaksa resigned after fleeing to Singapore in the wake of mass demonstrations at his home. Jubilant crowds expressed their joy in the capital Colombo despite curfews imposed to prevent possible unrest. Sri Lanka has for weeks experienced massive protests due to concerns of an economic meltdown. Frustrated Sri Lankans embarked on rallies over the mishandling of the country's economic crisis since its independence in 1948. For more on this, we're joined by Vinod Kumar Moonesinghe, an independent journalist from Sri Lanka. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us today on Newzroom Afrika. We know that the pressure has been mounting. The people in Sri Lanka are not happy with the manner in which the economy is functioning, and it was only a matter of time until matters descended into the chaos we saw. Talk to us about the build-up and the frustrations of the people of Sri Lanka.
Well, first of all, you have to go back to the colonial period when the British were ruling, where they established an economic system based on plantations and trade. The plantations paid for the imports, and we basically had no production in the country until the 1950s. From the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, there was a program of industrialization, which managed to increase the proportion of industry from 4% in 1955 to 22% in 1977. But thereafter, the economy was opened up and neoliberal policies were introduced. This led to the collapse of the industrial system. We had been exporting things like tea manufacturing machinery to countries in Africa, to Indonesia and to South America. That entire sector had to close down and the industrial sector collapsed. So instead of the capital-intensive industry we had earlier, we switched over to the labor-intensive industry like garment production, which was actually based on imports because we never built up the supply chain internally. It was all dependent on imports. In fact, when COVID struck China, we found that the garment factories were unable to produce because they didn't have any needles, because all the needles were being imported from China. So this situation has continued to get worse, and since the exports cannot pay for the imports, for the last 45 years we have been borrowing money to pay for imports, and the money has not been going into investment but into consumption. So we have seen a huge increase in the services sector, particularly in financial services, the growth has taken place because of our workers going overseas. About 20% of the workforce is overseas, sending back their remittances. And these remittances are the ones that keep the economy going. So what happened was that last year the government decided to clamp down on imports to try and balance the balance of payments. But what they did was they used limitations on opening letters of credit through the banks. So what the importers did was they bypassed this there is a system called undial or piggy bank in Tamil, which is an informal network of transferring money in and out of the country, which is totally illegal. And the importers started using undial to pay for their imports, because this drove up the value of the dollar versus the rupee, and then all the foreign workers started putting their transfers to Sri Lanka through the undial system instead of through legal systems. This caused a further foreign exchange shortage because that money was not coming in. So the effect of the import ban was totally lost.
Yeah, and of course this resulted in Sri Lankans not having much confidence in the president, Rajapaksa. And this all mounted into scenes that we watched on live television as thousands, hundreds of thousands of people descended on the president's property, going into his home, in his swimming pool, in his bed, saying that they also wanted to experience the kind of life that he was experiencing. And he's now had to flee for his life. He says he's fearful. He's resigned.
I should correct that slightly.
Yes.
What what actually precipitated the crisis was the war in Ukraine, which drove up prices of petrol and of gas. And this caused the government was unable to pay for the imports of gas and petrol, and this caused a huge shortage. And this is what precipitated the uprising. The people were standing in queues waiting for gas which never arrived. And this started actually because it started as a middle class uprising, because the poorer people were kept, they have been receiving money and food from the government continually throughout the COVID crisis. So the actual discontent was among the middle classes. And the people you see protesting are the lower middle class and middle class elements. Most of them have the same level of the same quality of life as the president, because the president didn't actually occupy the presidential palace, or what was called Queen's House originally. It's known as President's House.
Yes.
He didn't actually occupy it. He lived in his own private residence in a suburb of Colombo called Mirihana. He left that area after protesters burnt buses and cars outside his house and threatened to kill him. It's after that that he fled to the president's house in the heart of Colombo. And this building had not been built by him. It was built in the Dutch era about 200 years ago. And it had been occupied by Dutch governors and by British governors, and finally by the governors general, who were replaced by the presidential system. In fact, no president has ever lived in there since 1977. All of the presidents have lived in their own personal houses or at the prime minister's residence at temporary. So actually, it was the idea which was presented that he was living in luxury was completely wrong.
How then could he have been perceived to be living?
There has been a barrage of propaganda of this nature, most of it completely false, against the president. But he became an easy target because of the failure of the government to deal with the economic crisis.
Vinod, just hold on for me.
I should make that clear.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. So you're saying that he wasn't living in luxury and that the perceptions are incorrect. How was he living then? And what prompted, hundreds of thousands of people on going into that luxury home and swimming in his swimming tub and just living like what would be perceived as his life?
Would have been perceived, because basically that building is kept for visiting foreign dignitaries. So you cannot expect to host a foreign dignitary in anything except that kind of level of luxury. In fact, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa lived in a house in Mirihana, in a suburb of Colombo, which is about 10 kilometers from the center of the city. And his neighbors had no problem with him. It was the perception of him, which was being presented. He was supposed to have made $19 billion by robbing the economy, which is totally impossible given the checks and balances that exist in government spending. So there was a lot of black propaganda going around, which contributed to this problem. But the basic underlying problem was the suffering of the people because of the mishandling of I should say more than the mishandling of the economy. It's the basic problem in the country was that we were spending more than we earned. And at the same time, we got importers and exporters, both of them, misinvoicing, and it was revealed recently they have been misinvoicing at the rate of $5 billion a year.
Yeah. So now
and
that,
taking their money out of the
if you'll
country.
allow me to interrupt you
Yes.
there. So now that he has since fled to Singapore, we understand Singapore has confirmed that he's landed and he's been allowed to enter the country on a private visit. What happens to the political situation? Parliament accepted his resignation. What happens now in the midst of the false perceptions about the sort of benefits he may have enjoyed?
Well, I don't think there's going to be much. He's going to face any kind of retribution at the moment. There are people who are after his blood, but the general political people understand the situation. Most of the people who were demonstrating and who seized the president's house were in fact very young. They are not very conversant with the actual political situation or the things that go on. Some of them as young as 15. In fact, there were several incidents of stabbings as rival factions were fighting over the air-conditioned rooms and so on and so forth. So you've got all this chaos going on.
Who could be behind the perceptions? I mean, they've got to have been. They must have been fueled by something. Could it be a political situation where one end is fueling perceptions of the president?
Well, there was, as I said, there was a lot of black propaganda from various groups. There are a bunch of journalists, many of them who actually worked for Gotabaya, who have been leading these demonstrations through the media channels. So, and a lot of, as I said, memes have been circulating, which when they are repeated sufficiently, they create a wrong perception. And generally speaking, his family is anyway, although I don't think the president himself is corrupt, the rest of his family are considered to be corrupt. So much of that rubs off on him. From what I have gathered, he lives a very simple life. And I think most of those accusations against him are wrong. His major problem is that he is not a politician. He does not have a background in politics. He was a soldier originally. Then he went to the United States and he became a technician in IT. And then he returned to become the Secretary of the Ministry of Defense. So he really doesn't have a political background. He is unable to deal with political situations like this. So in that way, his resignation is very good because it means that the way is open for normal politicians to come in and manage the situation. And he appointed Ranil Wickremesinghe as his Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister. Yes. And Ranil Wickremesinghe has got a very good background in politics. He is very experienced. He's the second most experienced person in Parliament. And since Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned, he has been sworn in as acting president.
Yes, we're going to have to leave it there. And thank you for your time, journalist Vinod Kumar Moonesinghe, speaking to the political dynamics in Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksa family having dominated Sri Lanka politics for most part of 2 decades. Of course, we know that as a family, they've dominated and held key government positions. Some of the family members have since resigned in the wake of this chaos that has unfolded there. He's now fled to Singapore. We will